I was born in central Washington state and lived in an old Victorian-era house named after its original owners who built the place, Mary and John Shouty. I spent my first 6 years of my life in that house and have always felt connected to it on a deep level. And how could I not? Those 6 years were the foundation of my childhood after all. My mother, however, had always felt uneasy in the house alone, so she often held me while she danced to the beat of soothing music on the loudest sound setting to distract herself and make me happy. As I grew into my toddler stages of development, I began to notice slight oddities occurring inside the house, though, that I had never paid attention to before. Things like fruit falling to the floor from the table, lights flickering, turning off by themselves, and footsteps coming from the second floor when nobody was upstairs. But these strange occurrences gradually became more frequent, always being more intense than the last until they eventually just stopped. For months, nothing happened inside our house, and our family, who all agreed something was off, began to finally relax. One evening, though, around 8 p.m., months after the last occurrence, my mother was bathing in the second-floor bathroom near the staircase. My father was in Seattle for work at the time, and my brothers were all out with their friends, so the only two people in the house were my mother and I. Now, I just want to stress that there is no feasible way that anyone could have entered, nor climbed the creaky wooden stairs without making a sound. However, as my mother's back was turned to the open bathroom door, I pointed over her shoulder with, in her words, a stern, intense stare and said the word, "man," softly. Immediately, my mother swung around, only to be met by darkness and receding footsteps. She checked the hallway and every room in the house, finding no signs of entry or exit. Every single door and window was locked from the inside. She called the police and they did a sweep of the house too, and they didn't find anything either. After this, though, the footsteps, they started again along the daily night terrors, unexplainable cold rooms, and a boy who visited me in the middle of the night. He was my age, carried a brown teddy bear, and wore a tattered blue polo shirt with dirty cargo shorts. I was always willing to play with him, but my parents would wake up to me speaking into thin air and put me back to sleep all the time. When I reached the age of 4, I developed severe anxiety and constantly pleaded that my mother stay with me so I was never alone. I was a pretty clever kid with a lot of potential, and my mother did not want that potential to be snubbed by an overwhelming anxiety and fears that I struggled with due to my endless imaginations. My family gave me all the love and attention that I wanted and truly made me happy. But regardless, my fears persisted. So my mother attempted to curb this fear by using a psychology technique called in vivo treatment, giving me alone time and encouraging me to freely wander the house and face my fear, still supervising me, of course. One day I remember in particular was when my best friend Nick came over for a play date. We had a great time until my mum brought him outside when his parents arrived. As soon as they left the room, it became very unnervingly cold. I could physically see my breath coming out of my mouth, which made no sense considering it was springtime. I vividly remember seeing a woman walk past the door and then it slowly beginning to shut. Being a small child, I just cowered and feared and cried until my mum came in and saw the disheveled mess that I was. She held me and cooed and apologized for leaving me, and then the door shut, really hard. Needless to say, we didn't sleep in the house that night, and we seriously debated even going back. We eventually returned to the house, though, and immediately felt something was just wrong. My mother felt benevolence, and being Catholic, she called a priest to come cleanse the house. He said that he would be able to stop by in a few days and advised my parents to pray and watch over me carefully. A few days passed without any activity, and the priest was scheduled to come over that evening around 6 o'clock. It was 5:30 and I had sat down on the stair landing, having view of my mother in the kitchen and the top of the stairs. And the following moment has been burned into my brain from reliving it in my dreams, and it will never leave me as long as I live. I was looking toward my mother and I heard a whisper from upstairs. I turned my head to the right and looked up at just the most horrifying being that I have ever laid my eyes on. It was a perfect depiction of just evil. Honestly demonic. Its body was distorted into a shape that I can't even begin to describe, with a colour so black that it stood out from the rest of the unlit hallway. Its eyes were bloodshot, staring deep into my soul with just pure hatred, freezing me in place. The only thought that I had was to run, but my body was so stiff that I couldn't even speak. The being did not descend toward me, and it just kind of looked at me with a glare that would cause anyone to scream for their life. My mother eventually saw my pale, deathly expression and ran over, snapping me out of my trance. I looked at her and I shot a glance back to the stairs, only to be met with an empty hallway. The priest cleansed the entire home, and soon after my encounter with the demon, I developed a rare heart disease, and my parents divorced. I moved across the country with my mother, and we started an entirely new life at this point. It's honestly put me on edge for 18 years, and I've searched for so many answers that I can't even begin to tell you how much time I've spent on this. I'm finished feeling like I may be able to turn this around one day. I'm in the middle of serious research on this topic and plan to write follow-ups to this too. If you guys have any information on the subject, then please leave me a comment or message me privately. Thanks again for listening, and I have a lot more that I would like to share one day. So I was driving on the back roads on the edge of city limits. It was dark, no lighting at all, a few rest stops here and there, and I was meeting a woman off of Craigslist, already feeling a bit nervous. So I was going pretty fast, no other cars in sight, when, out of nowhere, I see a guy running across the road. He was already almost right in front of my car. It looked like he was getting chased by another guy who I didn't see until I swerved to avoid the first one while braking hard. My car went kind of sideways and hit the second guy pretty fierce, and not at full speed, mind you. I heard a loud thud, but I didn't actually see him get hit. My car ended up on the side of the road. The first guy seems to have kept running out of sight. He wasn't there when I got out. This was a huge red flag, obviously, but I had just hit someone, and I was worried that I had offed them. I was all shaky and had that sinking feeling in my stomach. I ran towards a guy who was on the floor breathing heavily. Thank goodness he was alive. I asked him if he was okay, and he didn't respond. He just kept breathing really hard, and then I took out my phone to call 911. As I'm typing out the number, that's when I heard him say, "No, don't call anyone, don't call the cops." He said it pretty alarmed too, so I just looked over at him with my phone in hand, flash on. I asked him if he could stand, and he got up slowly with a slight limp. With my light shining on him now, I could see his clothes were all tattered, and he was wearing like 2 layers of clothes with a jacket, now torn at the arms. He had blood on his arms, I guessed from where he landed on the ground. He said, "I'm fine, do you have any cigarettes?" I said, "Yeah, let me go and get them." I had a pack in my glove box since forever. I was an occasional smoker and only smoked with my coworker, and not in a while though. So we walked over to my car and I got the cigarettes and handed them to him. Then I put my phone on charge and the car was still on. As I did, he asked for a lighter and I said, "Yeah, hold on, let me look for it." While lighting his cigarette, that's when I asked him who was the other guy. And he said, "Someone stole my backpack from me while I was sleeping." And I thought to myself, okay, so he was definitely a homeless man. I honestly felt really bad for him and I started pulling out my wallet. I wanted to give him all the money in my wallet out of guilt. I mean, he looked fine now though, albeit bloody scraped arms, as his breathing had gotten normal, but while pulling out my wallet and asking, "You sure you don't want me to call an ambulance?" That's when I felt the sharpest pain just rock my face. I saw all blurry for a couple of seconds, and I started stumbling. My body felt like it was about to fall over, dizzy, and when I came to, I saw my car pulling away and driving off. He had punched me and just took off, and left me with a pretty bad headache to boot. I stood there in shock for what seemed like an eternity. I reached for my phone out of instinct, and then I remembered that I left it in there charging. I reached under my jacket to check if my gun was still on me. I felt relieved when I felt the cold metal of it. At least I ain't out here defenseless. And so I kept walking down the road, endlessly, hoping to find someone. I'm pretty ticked off, and to be honest, I'm pretty scared too. A few good miles later, I see some lights though. As I get closer, I see it's one of those public restrooms with nothing else in sight. And, well, at least there may be a payphone. And at that moment, what do you think it is that I see next? I could not believe my eyes. There's a car, and it looks just like mine parked right out front. I take a peek, and the guy that took my car is asleep. Looks like he cleaned his arms off too. There's no jacket either. Now, I just gotta say here that this guy was a complete moron. He could have kept driving, but I'm glad that he didn't. So I take out my gun and I try to open the door, but it's locked. I try all the other doors, and they're locked too. I didn't want to wake him up by banging on the door because I was afraid that he was going to just take off again. I looked all over the ground, nothing to break the window with though. So I holster my gun, take off my jacket and wrap it around my hand, and I smash straight through the window, glass spilling everywhere. The guy jerks awake and starts fumbling around. All the while I drop the jacket and rapidly unholster my gun again. I'm pointing my gun right at his head and he says, "Please don't shoot me." Instead of saying sorry, he says that. I mean, come on. I tell him to get out and walk towards the wall with his back turned, so I backed up and he complied. I tell him not to move and ask him where my keys are, and after I got my keys from him, I drove off with glass just all over inside of my car. I never called the cops because, well, I'd hit him earlier, and then because I pulled a gun on him too. I was scared and worried about the legality of it all, and also I had bought it from an arms list, but seller never signed the bill of sale, only I did. So I was sketched out about that as well. I mean, the last thing I need is them checking my gun after he tells them about it and finding out the guy who sold me it reported it as stolen or something. I probably would have been fine calling them, but honestly, I was completely tripping at the time. We lived in a small 3-story house before we moved here. Over time, strange things that we couldn't explain happened to almost all of us. It's going to be a bit of a long one, so please bear with me. So, my sister often complained of finding lost things in odd places. Examples are like she untied a scrunchie in the bathroom to tidy up her hair and it disappeared, later to be found at the bottom of the stairs. My other sister had the door to her room open by itself, and one time in the winter, me and my sister were lying in bed and the ceiling fan just turned on by itself. But once we were all at my aunt's and 2 of my sisters were home alone. When we came back, they had locked their room, claiming that they heard footsteps on the stairs outside the room. The footsteps were heavy as if it was a man's, and persistent, as if someone was coming down and going up again consistently. Of course, all the doors were locked and there was no theft or trace of someone coming in. We also heard footsteps upstairs once when we were younger too. We had cousins over and no adult in the house, and we even went to investigate, armed with brooms and wipers. But there was nothing. Once I was looking for a book in the study, which was rarely used anyway, with my back to the door, which was one of those doors with springs in the hinges that can't stay in place by themselves, when I suddenly heard the door behind me creak open. I turned around, completely expecting to see someone coming in, and I froze. The door was standing halfway open, as if someone was holding it in place. I stood holding my breath and watched it slowly close back again. Needless to say, I ran the hell out of there as fast as I could. In the same room another time, I was sitting working on some art and craft stuff when my penknife just disappeared. I tried to look for it in vain, and eventually I just gave up, when it suddenly fell onto my lap from behind my shoulder. I picked it up and it felt hot. It was metal, and I tried to think that maybe it got tangled up in my hair or something, but there was no way that I wouldn't have felt it, and for it to be that hot was really weird. One afternoon, me and my sister were watching TV while my mother was in another room offering prayer, and both of us saw someone open the door and pop their head in from around the corner with their own eyes. But we didn't think much of it, assuming my sister was home from work or something. Except, we realized eventually that she wasn't. In fact, there was no one home but us. Later on too, it started getting even more threatening. One afternoon, all of us were on the roof when my sister came home to find 3 knobs on the stove completely turned on with the gas leaking. Another time, the gas pipe from the heater came off by itself while it was on, which is very tight and takes a lot of effort to undo. And no one was in that room. Luckily, my father saw it and was able to turn it off before something bad happened, but still, it was pretty creepy. Then, one day, we had this air cooler set up in the corner where there was an open shaft that ran along the back. It had cars at the roof, which is an organic material that cools the air when wet. And the cars, they caught fire. And again, we were lucky that we saw it in time from the window before it escalated out of control. It was evening, so no chance of it being caused by the sun, but there were no wires or electricity around the area that could cause it. And the only way to explain it was to say someone threw a burning match from the neighboring house, which was higher up, and there's just no way that a match wouldn't go out falling all the way down there. And boy, am I glad that we moved out of there. So just some quick background to the layout of the house. When you walk up the stairs, directly in front of you is my boyfriend's room, and to the left is my mum's. So for her to go downstairs, she has to pass our bedroom. So this happened Mother's Day. British, so it was about a week ago. Me and my boyfriend wake up, he goes to the toilet, then pokes his head in and says that he's going to make his mum a cup of tea to bring up to her for Mother's Day. He pulls the door shut and everything's fine. Then I hear his mum get up and I think, oh no, she's going to go down and ruin the surprise. And she does. She leaves her room and pauses at the top of the stairs and peeks through the crack in the door and then carries on down the stairs. I wait to hear them talking down there, but I never do. Then, not 5 minutes later, I hear my boyfriend walk back up the stairs and go into his mum's room, where I then hear him say good morning and her reply all excited. But I knew that she had not come back up the stairs again and into bed. Safe to say that I did freak out a little bit, and when my boyfriend came back into the room, I said, "How come you didn't talk to your mum when she came down?" And he is adamant that she didn't. I asked her, and she swears that she was in bed the whole time and has no reason to lie. What bothers me the most, though, was that whatever this thing was, it was looking at me for at least 5 seconds through the door. It gives me chills remembering it, and I thought maybe it was her checking if we were up or downstairs without having to knock and come in. If anyone can please offer any kind of explanation to me, I would love to hear it. I thought maybe that it was one of those instances where people have doppelgangers. But is it? I don't know, and I would love some help. So it was 1997 and I was 5, and my family took me on a trip to southern China. As we were walking down a major commercial district in downtown Shenzhen, I saw 4 young men walking towards us side by side, all fashionable and metropolitan looking. It's a busy street in midday, very crowded, but it's wide enough for 10 people to walk shoulder to shoulder, so they have no need to walk toward our side of the street, but they did anyway. The place is a shopping district with plenty to see. My dad was walking on the right, Mum is in the middle, loosely holding my hand, and as the men that I've mentioned were just walking past us, I felt a firm grasp on my left forearm. They kept walking as if nothing happens. My parents kept scrolling shops, and I was confused by the situation, but didn't know what to do. So I squeezed my mum's hand as hard as I could, didn't even think about making a noise. And then the tug on my arm grew stronger. I grabbed her hand harder until she turned and looked at me, and the arm slipped away. She didn't see a thing, and I couldn't find the words to describe what happened because I was so young and all. Years later, as I was in college, I told her the story, and it was a bit of an eye-opener for me because if you know anything about China, kidnapping children there is common and extremely horrible. So a few years ago, I owned a recording studio in Rock Springs, Wyoming, in the basement of the old Woolworths building. My brother-in-law ran a snowboard shop up on the main floor, and the basement had a room that I used to record musicians. This whole basement couldn't be kept lit, and I would buy light bulb after light bulb every week to replace the ones that had popped. But one room would stay somewhat lit, so I just set up shop there. There were many experiences that were just unexplainable there, but one stands out above the others. So I just finished recording a band that evening, and they all packed up and left. I locked the door behind them and watched them drive away. Going back down to the studio in the basement, I went to start mixing the audio. About 20 minutes into the process, I stopped the music for a second to adjust some things and heard running down the stairs to the basement, and then frantic running down the hallway toward my room. I had left the door open. I looked down the hallway to see what was going on, but there was absolutely nothing there. I was quite freaked out, but I really needed to get the mixes done, so I just went back to work and tried hard to concentrate on the music. About 5 minutes later, the exact same thing happened, except this time, I ran to the hallway to catch the cause of the noise. So there I am, staring down this dark hallway, hearing something frantically running towards me, and there's nothing there that I can see. I checked the entire basement, which honestly scared the crap out of me because there was only one light still working in the rest of the basement. And I found nothing and no one. I went and checked the door upstairs and it was locked. I went back down to the studio and decided to put on some headphones to keep the creepiness out, and, well, that didn't work at all because as I was mixing, I could feel just a horribly angry presence behind me. In my mind, I could see exactly what the presence looked like too. It was a really old, bald Asian man, about 40-ish, and I just kept looking behind me, but there was nothing there. Soon, the man felt like he was standing right over me, his fists clenched and up over his head like he was going to hit me, and I turned around and saw a door down the hallway close slightly on its own. And at that point, that was it. I was out of there, and I packed up my studio the next week, and I just never went back. But after studying a bit about the history of the area, I come to find out that there was what was dubbed the Chinese massacre on that same street about 100 years ago, where a bunch of Chinese railway workers were killed by local folks for taking their jobs. Like I said, I've never been back to that place since. So this is a bit of a weird one. It happened in the summer of 1993 when I was 4 years old. I had a fairly new doll that I got for my birthday. It was a chunky little girl doll with blonde braided hair, smiling with painted on eyes. Not mobile eyeballs, they were painted on like you would see on Barbies or something. My mum was kneeling beside me, putting her arm around me and said, "You're a good mummy to this doll," and I nodded and embraced the doll. In my head, almost kind of like a psychic prediction, I could see the doll's eyes close shut if I sneezed on it. And some weird words came up in my mind saying that the doll would disappear forever and never be seen again. I was really confused, being really young, and seeing the image in my head about what would happen if I sneezed on it. Then, coincidentally, I needed to sneeze. I struggled to snuff the incoming sneeze, but it was inevitable. I really don't want to make the doll sleeping and disappear, and I believed the vision in my head. I mean, what can a 4-year-old do but believe, right? I sneezed on it, and my mum gasped with a surprised face expression while looking at the doll. The eyes were shut closed with purple eyeshadow and lashes down, just like what I saw in my mind right before it happened. My mum freaked out, grabbed the doll and put it under hot steaming water, trying to get the eyes to open. And it doesn't work. So she took out an ice cube from the freezer and pressed it on so hard the face concaved. She repeated hot water and ice with shaky hands. It was known at the time that some 90s dolls have heat and cold reactive eyes, but I promise you that this one does not have that feature. It was just a plain doll and its package. It was just a plain doll and its package box mentioned nothing about reactive eyes or anything. She handed me the doll with a frightened look and said, "So sorry, but the doll is broken. It wouldn't wake up." I was so uncomfortable and disappointed at myself for ruining it. I moved it on the top of the toy pile in a large circular bucket storage for toys in my bedroom. I was about to walk out of my room, but immediately changed my mind about abandoning the doll and wanted it back. I turned around and the doll just wasn't there anymore. It just disappeared into thin air within 5 seconds. I told my mum the doll disappeared, and she really freaked out at this, and we dumped the entire contents of the toy bucket out to look for it together, and it literally just disappeared forever and never returned. I asked my mum about it when I was older, but she said that she doesn't really remember much. If I were her and were to see something freaky like that, it would sear in my memory forever though, so that's a bit strange. Because of this incident, I was actually a big believer in the toys were alive, like in Toy Story, for many years until I was old enough to realize that that was just not the case. Like I said, I know it's a weird story, but I'm wondering if it's happened to anyone else before. I would love to hear your stories if you have something similar.